Picture 13 little countries strung along the edge of a continent, each with its own government, its own money, its own church, its own army, its own laws. They quarreled over borders. They taxed each other's goods. Some of them could barely stand each other. They were not one nation. They were 13 separate experiments, run by one distant king, 3,000 miles of ocean away. This is the story of the 13 colonies, how they were planted, how they grew wild, and how, without ever meaning to, they grew together. It began as a business venture. In 1607, 3 ships funded by London investors sailed into Chesapeake Bay, and 104 colonists built a fort on a swampy river island. They called it Jamestown. It was very nearly the end of the story. The water was foul, the summers brought fever, and the colonists, many of them gentlemen who had never held a shovel, starved. In the winter of 1609, 8 in 10 of them died. What saved Virginia was not gold. It was a weed, tobacco, sweet, fashionable, and wildly profitable in London. Within a decade, Virginians were planting it in the streets. And in the year 1619, 2 things arrived in Virginia within weeks of each other, and American history would be shaped by both. The first was an elected assembly, the House of Burgesses, the first representative government in the Americas. The second was a ship carrying some 20 captive Africans sold to the colonists. Self-government and slavery planted in the same soil, in the same summer. Meanwhile, far to the north, a different kind of colony was coming. In 1620, the Mayflower missed its course to Virginia and dropped anchor off Cape Cod, carrying religious separatists we remember as the Pilgrims. Before landing, 41 men signed a compact. They would govern themselves by common consent. 10 years later, a great fleet of Puritans followed and built Boston, a disciplined, godly commonwealth their governor called a city upon a hill. Business in the south, conscience in the north. 2 seeds, 2 very different Americas. From those seeds, colonies multiplied. New England spun off rebels and dissenters. Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams, banished from Massachusetts for demanding what almost no one in the world then allowed, that every soul worship freely. In the South, Maryland rose in 1634 as a refuge for Catholics. The Carolinas were carved out for 8 aristocrats and later split in 2. And last of all came Georgia in 1733, a colony for honest debtors and a buffer against Spanish Florida. And in the middle, the colonies England simply took. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbor of Dutch New Amsterdam, and its governor, Peter Stuyvesant, surrendered without a shot. New Amsterdam became New York. From it were cut New Jersey and Delaware. And in 1681, the king paid off a debt with land and handed a Quaker named William Penn a wilderness bigger than England. Penn planted Pennsylvania, religious tolerance, fair treaties with the Lenape, and a city of brotherly love called Philadelphia, soon the largest city in the colonies. By 1733, there they were, 13 colonies, shoulder to shoulder, along 1,000 miles of coast, stern New England, trading in fish, timber, and ships. The middle colonies, wheat-rich and dizzyingly diverse. And the southern colonies, wealthy in tobacco, rice, and indigo, wealth raised in ever-growing measure by the labor of enslaved Africans who by the Revolution's eve would be 1 in 5 of all the people in the 13. So, how were they governed? Each colony was its own little world, but most shared a shape. At the top, a governor, usually sent from London. Beside him, an elected assembly. And here was the secret engine of American politics. The assemblies controlled the money. No assembly vote, no taxes, no governor's salary. Royal governors arrived with grand instructions and learned to negotiate. In New England, villages ran themselves in town meetings where ordinary farmers stood and voted. In the South, planters presided over counties like little lords, and over it all, in theory, stood the laws of trade, the Navigation Acts, steering colonial commerce through English ports. In practice, smuggling was a respectable profession. Molasses slipped in from the French islands, and officials looked away. London, busy with its own wars, mostly let the colonies be. A policy later given a beautiful name: salutary neglect. Left alone, the colonies exploded. 250,000 people in 1700. By 1775, 2.5 million, doubling every generation, faster than anywhere in Europe. Cities like Philadelphia and Boston hummed with printers, newspapers, and coffeehouse argument. A Boston boy who ran away to Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin, could rise from printer's apprentice to the most famous American in the world. They were prosperous, they were practiced in self-rule, and they were still, proudly, stubbornly, British. But here is the part we forget. The colonies did not like each other. New York and New Hampshire nearly came to blows over land. Pennsylvania and Maryland feuded so long that two surveyors, Mason and Dixon, had to draw them a line. Their money differed, their churches differed. A Virginia planter had more in common with a London merchant than with a Boston fisherman. In 1754, with war against France looming, Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan, one grand council for the mainland colonies. He printed America's first political cartoon to sell it, a snake cut into pieces over 3 words: join or die. Every single colonial assembly turned it down. Nobody would surrender an inch of local power. The war came anyway. The French and Indian War, where a 22-year-old Virginia colonel named George Washington fired some of the first shots of a world war. For 9 years, redcoats and colonists fought side by side, and in 1763, Britain won it all. France was swept from the continent. Church bells rang from Boston to Savannah. The colonists had never felt more British, and Britain had never been deeper in debt. Both of those facts were about to matter. The bill came due. London had doubled its national debt defending America. Surely, ministers reasoned, Americans should help pay. And so, for the first time, Parliament reached directly into the colonies. First, it drew a line, the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement beyond the Appalachians. Then, in 1765, the Stamp Act, a tax on every newspaper, pamphlet, contract, and deck of cards, the first direct tax Parliament had ever laid on America. The reaction stunned everyone. Mobs marched, stamp officials resigned in terror, and 9 colonies, who could agree on nothing, sent delegates to a common Congress. Their argument was simple. They elected no one to Parliament, so Parliament could not tax them. No taxation without representation. The Stamp Act was repealed. Parliament tried again with new duties. Boston answered with boycotts. In 1770, nervous redcoats fired into a Boston crowd, killing 5, and colonial printers named it a massacre. Then, in December 1773, protesters dressed as Mohawks boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and heaved 342 chests of East India Company tea into the sea. Parliament's patience snapped. In 1774, it closed the port of Boston and stripped Massachusetts of self-government. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, and something remarkable happened. Carolina rice, Virginia flour, and Connecticut sheep flowed north to feed blockaded Boston. And in September 1774, in Philadelphia, 12 of the 13 colonies sent 56 delegates to a First Continental Congress. 13 strangers were learning at last to act as one. They still called themselves loyal subjects of the king. Most of them meant it. But that winter, in the villages around Boston, farmers began drilling on the green and hiding muskets and powder under barn floors, ready to march at a minute's warning. 13 separate experiments, planted for profit, for God, and for refuge, had grown into something no one had planned. And on a spring morning in 1775, on a village green called Lexington, but that is the next story.